And welcome to Master Gamers Gaming. So this video is it's a midnight prep story recap. Look, if you've been loosely following WoW's story lately, or if you're coming back after a break, leading into midnight, it can feel like you're kind of getting dropped into the deep end. So this story, or this video rather, it's a story and lore video. It's kind of going to talk about the threads that matter, the characters that you need to remember, and why the story is now pointing back to Quel'Thalas. So we're not going to go over any gearing, patch notes, or systems for Midnight. It's just kind of like a narrative setup. So you're not, going into Midnight thinking like, how did we get here? Now, if you do want some longer versions, I've got the full campaign for 11.2.7, the new recap that they introduced, like an abridged version of the War Within story, and the Lore Walking Quel'Thalas video. So they're going to be linked down in the description. We're going to pin them down in the comments as well. Completely optional, but this recap should suffice to get you up to speed. So just so we're on the same page, going to be doing three things. Going to give you kind of like the big story thread that's been building up for a while, and how it ties into Midnight. And then we're going to talk about the War Within main beats that you need to remember. So we're not going to go into every detail, just the pieces that kind of carry forward into the next expansion. And then we'll kind of go over a little bit of Quel'Thalas and the elves context, because it kind of makes a lot of sense with Midnight. You need to remember like where we're going. So we're going to Quel'Thalas. Seems to be a lot of pressure around that area now, like leading into the Midnight cinematic, which showed them attacking the Sunwell. So now, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the Void thread and how it matters now. If you kind of zoom out, Warcraft has always had this sense of, that Azeroth isn't just a world, it's a prize. But over the last few expansions, the story is kind of nudging us into kind of an uncomfortable idea that the Void isn't just a horror theme, it's actually a faction, and they're a faction with intent. Now that matters because Midnight, it's not being framed as we found a new villain in a new zone. It's being framed as a big next step into a bigger conflict. So it's not one that's a theoretical theme anymore or conflict. It's now actually happening. So this is where we bring Alleria Windrunner into the story and where she matters. She's not just some other elf character. She's one of the clearest bridge characters in WoW's current modern story. It's someone who's lived close to the Void, carries all the things that come with the Void, all those scars and the whispers, but still functions as a person that you can kind of build the narrative around. Then you got Xal'atath, kind of like our main villain at the moment. She keeps coming up, not just because she's written like one. She's not one that you just kind of have there and you defeat and move on and forget about her. She's kind of like a catalyst. She appears, she kind of destabilizes the board. She takes some important things or gets some power and then she moves on. And the object that's mostly tied her in the War Within has been the Dark Heart. A lot of the story endings are really the Dark Heart either changing hands or changing what it contains. Now, if we move into the War Within story beats, essentially we start off with 11.0. So when the expansion came out, it opens up with the sense that something's wrong on a deep level. And you've got the Radiant Song, the feeling that the world itself is reacting and trying to force attention onto something buried and dangerous. This pulls all our big names together. Like the first cinematic started with Thrall and Anduin, and he brings everyone to Dalaran, because that's where you need to go to get your answers. And then the story flips and the expansion kind of starts. So Alleria realizes that Xal'atath infiltrated the city, and then the Nerubians hit Dalaran. Civilians are being taken, and in the middle of it, Xal'atath uses the Dark Heart to absorb Dalaran's arcane power and obliterates the city, and Khadgar is seemingly lost in that blast.
Guardian.
So from there, the story kind of becomes a fallout and a war footing. You establish yourself in Khazalgar, you form some alliances, and you start realizing that you're not just chasing mysteries anymore, you're responding to a set of moves. And then that's kind of where the big starting act ends. And we're starting moving towards the end of the initial 11.0 story. So we go to Hellafall, and Xal'atath is kind of channeling energy into the Dark Heart, and Alleria essentially confronts her. She lands a shot that cracks the Dark Heart, and it forces Xal'atath to retreat. And in the aftermath of that, Khadgar emerges from the Dark Heart, and it was revealed that he was trapped inside ever since Dalaran's destruction. So the campaign kind of sort of ends there, or the leveling campaign, but it's not really like a we solved it sort of thing. It's more like, we forced the villain Xal'atath to pull back, we got Khadgar back, and then we learned that the war has a structure and momentum. Eventually, we lead into Nerebar Palace. Xal'atath formed an alliance with some of the Nerubians, particularly Queen Ansarek, and then the raid kind of ends with a theme that, Ansarek essentially falls, and Xal'atath makes it brutally clear that they were never promised any salvation, only usefulness, just a means to an end, and using them for her gain.
So easily overlooked, yet cutting deeper than the sharpest blade. Shh. It's almost over. Your ambition was rare, Yet despite even betraying your own mother, here you are. You promised nothing. Yet I gave you everything. You were just not enough. Pity me. I don't. You were a means to an end. Your survival wasn't necessary. I simply wish you had lasted a little longer. And now you learn the true lesson of the Void. Only the strongest survive.
And then this kind of leads into a bridging story where we have the Siren Isle. We have a bit of a Dalaran epilogue about the aftermath of the city, how the Kirin Tor is moving on. But there's nothing really too important to talk about on this front. You kind of get a bit of a lead into Undermine. And that's where kind of like the big major story kind of picks up. So 11.1 kind of shifts from a catastrophic event into kind of like a pursuit quest. Wars, they're not just fought on battlefields. They're logistics, influence, and the people who quietly move the power around. And Undermine is a perfect example. of that. It's an area with heaps of cartel politics, backroom deals, and the machinery that fuels a bigger war. So the conclusion beat is pretty simple here. You can win the room, but the artifact, it keeps on moving. Essentially, throughout the story, the Dark Art is trying to be repaired. Gallowix has been tasked with this from Xal'atath, and essentially, Gallowix, you can tell, kind of has a bit of an ulterior motive. He's always looking at doing things for his benefit, but he essentially gets tricked by an ethereal. So you got Phase Thief Azir essentially taking the Dark Heart, and obviously Gallowix thinks it's one of Xal'atath's agents, but it's not, and he disappears with it. And much to Xal'atath's dissatisfaction, like always, she abandons him. And, the Undermine Revolution essentially is in full swing then, and the goblins are obviously trying to get the Undermine back from Gallowix's control. We kind of enter the raid zone, and essentially 11 point ends with Gallowix's defeat. He kind of falls out of his mech suit, and the mech suit collapses and crushes him, ends his reign.
Worthless hunk of junk!
Hey, hold on!
It's not over till I say it's over. And I always win!
Look out!
Huh? Ah! Let's get out of here.
But once again, the piece that matters, the Dark Heart, is missing, and the war momentum continues. We also have a bridging story after Azrek's fall. We have the Sareki lashing out against Hellowfall, but nothing too important there. We get a Legacy of Arathor kind of mini campaign that goes on about the Arathi Highlands and the tensions that are there with Faerun, Danath, and Gayara. We get some lore walking about Xal'atath's backstory and the ethereal history. Xal'atath's been at play with the Void for a very long time. And as we lead into 11.2, which is Ghosts of Koresh, we see how Xal'atath weaved into that with the Void Lord Dimensius, and obviously breaking away from him. So when we do go to Koresh, the shattered ethereal homeworld, the Dark Heart headed there, and that's where the consequences of that artifact essentially become fairly cosmic. So the patch centers on Dimensius, like I mentioned, the all-devouring, and it's a thread of Tyr that isn't a corruption of a city, but a devourer of worlds. Essentially, we have a big chase, partnering up with Xal'atath, much to Alleria's distaste, but obviously Xal'atath has a ton of knowledge, essentially on how Dimensius works, how we're going to be able to get close to him. It's how we get our artifact. Essentially, once we eventually get into Minor Forge Omega, Dimensius essentially is defeated with obviously our help and Xal'atath's help, and contained within the Dark Heart. But it's not a clean, it's over. It's essentially an escalation point in what the artifact now contains, because then you get the gut punch. Xal'atath obviously seemingly is all, I'll stay behind and keep him contained. And, Xal'atath also seemingly is contained in the Dark Heart because of that. But then Xal'atath emerges from the Dark Heart and essentially replaces Locust Walker in there, but not even replacing, just straight up blows him up and manages to escape with the artifact anyway. So once again, 11.2 didn't end with a we won moment. It ends with a we stopped the immediate apocalypse. We still watched the villain walk away with the weapon, even more powerful than before.
Theseus is gone.
Not gone, but contained within the dark heart.
As is Xal'atath. A fitting end for her. No. Wait! You... What did you do?
I kept my promise. Together, we vanquished Dimensius. And I now have all I need to claim what is mine. Oh, this has been a delight, Alleria. But our little game is over. When next we meet, I will take everything you love.
That leads into the current patch now, 11.2.7. So the warning, it's framed kind of that, Koresh has been put to rest, new danger looms, and that's how we have Varisa Windrunner being struck by a whole bunch of new visions and a new threat. You got the prophecy of the fall of Quel'Thalas, and then the campaign continues with visions of a shadowed sun, and essentially it seems like it's all just pointing back to Quel'Thalas. We very briefly go into the Maw to seek Sylvanas' help, but Sylvanas is, down in the Maw and has a job to do down there. So we get set on kind of our own path to save Azeroth, pretty much, and it's pretty much all going to be up to Alleria and us. Now, that's kind of like the main War Within story beats that you kind of need to go into Midnight with. But now the important part is what is carrying forward into Midnight. So what I can tell you is essentially you have your first thread, which is the Void conflict isn't a distant enemy or distant thing anymore. It's organized, it targets, and it's escalating. And the Dark Heart story has proven it can jump from city-level catastrophes to cosmic-level consequences. You have your second thread, which is that the story's narrowing towards symbolic pressure points now. That's why we have Quel'Thalas and the Sunwell make narrative sense. It's bringing a lot of emotional weight, geopolitical consequences, and a power source that can be framed as existential. And then you have the elf story, which is kind of becoming the emotional center. So the story, it says uniting the elven tribes. So it's not just a rallying cry, it's a guarantee that old wounds are going to be reopened under the pressure that's going to come with the Void incursion to Quel'Thalas. So with that, we can kind of talk about Quel'Thalas a little bit more properly here. So if you're new to WoW, you're going to think of Quel'Thalas as just the Blood Elf zone. Now, the reason it matters is because it's one of Warcraft's, clearest examples of surviving after a catastrophe. The Blood Elves, they aren't defined by victory. They're defined essentially by what they live through. Devastation, fractured identity, and the way that survival changes what people are willing to do. And at the heart of that story, you have the Sunwell. It's not just power, but recovery, stability. The idea that after everything, they rebuilt a future around something sacred, being a great source of power in the holy light. So now if you're the void and you thrive on corruption and despair, well, the Sunwell, it's not just a target for power, it's a target for their hope. So then you layer that with the elf tensions that make up, uniting the tribes, and it becomes complicated. You got the Blood Elves and their homeland identity. It's linked to their sovereignty, their pride, their survival. You got their long memory of exile and the fracture. And then you have the modern Void thread sitting right beside it all through Alleria, the Void Elves, and what they represent. So, that's why Midnight can really hit emotionally. It's not just a we fight a Void invasion. There's a lot more at play, and that comes from them having the World Sword saga. It's a big building moment. So it's a we fight a Void invasion in a place where identity, exile, and survival, they're already very raw nerves. And that's what the World Sword saga is kind of trying to build up to. And it's where Shadowlands failed completely. Like Shadowlands, the Jailer could have been an amazing villain if it was built up over time. But it was rushed. Whereas Xal'atath, you find people will sympathize and have way more of a liking to Xal'atath because of the longer drawn out conflict. So hopefully Midnight can continue to grow the story in an exciting way, and hopefully not nail the landing and fall flat. So pretty much, sum it all up, we got the Void escalation, we've got the War Within being a turning point, and Quel'Thalas as the pressure point that Midnight is aiming towards. Now, if you want to go deeper, like I said, I've linked 3 options depending on what you're after below. We have a full campaign playthrough of the latest patch. There's an abridged version of The War Within, which is a recap of essentially all the campaigns up to and finishing the Ghosts of Koresh. And there's a lot walking in Quel'Thalas if you want something a little bit deeper and regional with elf context in mind. So all those are pinned in the comments. It's in the description as well. And thanks for watching. And if you want, tell me which thread you're most curious about going into Midnight. Are you more for the Void side? Are you interested in the elf politics? Or the Sunwell side? So as always, thanks for watching, happy gaming, and see you in the next one.